This is every weapon Pack-a-Punched in Black Ops 6 Zombies. We're going to be showing you how it changes when you pack it, so you know if it's worth doing it or not. And we'll start off with the knife. You spawn in with the knife, so it's a gray rarity weapon in your game. So at base, it pretty much caps out at about 675 damage. But if we throw on Melee Macchiato and we put it in that Pack-a-Punch machine, it looks snazzy, first of all, with its baked bean camo, and it's also much more viable for melee-focused builds. But I wouldn't use it as your primary weapon if you're not making a complete melee build. Next, we have the 9mm pistol. I'm not really a fan of this one. I think that it's just pretty garbage overall. Doesn't have a lot of ammo, and even at higher rarity, like purple like this, it just doesn't do a lot. And when you Pack-a-Punch it, it turns into the War, which sounds like it should be pretty decent, but honestly, it stays pretty weak. It doesn't have any big transformations like the Mustang and Sally. It's just a little bit more powerful. Next is the PP919, and I'm actually a really big fan of this gun. I really like it, even unpack-a-punched. It's just got a decent amount of ammo. It feels pretty strong. It kind of behaves the way you expect it to. And I'm always a fan of like a PP Bison type weapon in Call of Duty. So this one scores points for me before it's even packed. But then when you pack it, oh my God, I love it. It has so much ammo, so you can just fire it forever. Like, it feels insane to just shoot for that long, combined with augments in the game that mean that you can reload your clip while you're shooting and stuff like that. It just makes it a blast to play with. And its name becomes You're in Trouble, and really that's true. The zombies are in trouble when you got it in your hands because you're just never going to stop shooting them in the face. Next up is the LR762 Sniper, and this is a pretty slow sniper unpack-a-punched, and it's strong as a result, but just get a load of what this thing turns into when it's packed, okay? So its Pack-a-Punch name is Rad Lamb Blaster, and it's incredible because it's got explosive rounds just out of nowhere. Nobody saw this coming for the LR762, and yet here it is, basically acting like a grown-up version of a Mustang and Sally. Like, it's really fun to use. Its only downside is just that it's a slow sniper rifle still, and so you've got to contend with the fact that you're really queuing up your shots with this thing. And that's where I guess attachments and augments start to come into play. Next is the trusty XM4. This thing's all over the place in Call of Duty. It's a fan favorite, and it's solid, unpacked. You'll find it on the floor pretty much every game because there's NPCs in the world that will drop it when you kill them and stuff like that. So it's a very common weapon to come across. It's also on a lot of wall buys, but it's not the most strong weapon in the game by any means. So it's just kind of all reliable. And then Pack-a-Punched, it becomes the Zeistermeister, which I guess is what the XM stands for in XM4, and we just never knew that before. And as zesty as the name sounds, it sort of stays a pretty run-of-the-mill standard AR when packed. Like, there's nothing about this that's particularly crazy, but honestly, that's what you come to the XM4 for, so no harm, no foul. I think it's a solid weapon and definitely a good choice in any game. Next, we have the Strider. It's a pretty weak generic pistol, and then it pack-punches into the Ranger, and this is interesting because it's actually a Lord of the Rings reference. So the unpacked name was Strider, right? And now it's become the Ranger, and that's Aragorn, the Ranger of the North, also known as Strider. Sadly, it sucks. Next, we have the XMG. This is another LMG where it's got a box magazine on it. Sure, it's fun. You can fire it forever, but when you Pack-a-Punch it, it turns into the Xenon Matter Granulator, and it has a hilarious amount of ammo if you've got a box mag on. You're gonna have 400 rounds in your box, and then 600 in reserve. And so when I talk about not having to reload your weapon and just firing forever, this is maybe the best example of it in the entire game, maybe. But obviously the downside with all that ammo is that the individual rounds don't do a lot. So doesn't pack the punch that I wish it would. Next is the Jackal. This is one that you'll probably get off the ground quite frequently in your games. It's just one of those weapons that you'll get from those NPCs in those scripted world events. And because of that, you're going to level it up pretty quickly, so you'll probably get some good attachments on it as well, which is nice. I think in terms of its performance, it's just fine. It's certainly nothing special. It's pretty middle of the road. And packed, it turns into the Embalmer JNPW, and not a lot else changes, to be honest. I think it's still fairly fairly weak, and it's not something that I gravitate to particularly frequently in my games personally. Next, we've got the GPR-91. Now, this kind of looks like, I think it's the Enfield from Black Ops 1, which is a gun that I used to love back in the day, and I think that in a zombies context, it just doesn't really perform here. But it has a trick up its sleeve, because when you pack-a-punch it, the GPR becomes the Geomide 41, which sounds unintelligible at first, but then you think GPR, Geomide, you do a little Google, you realize it's a gopher. That's what Geomide is. And GPR is just gopher. So it's the gopher gun, and it's about as you'd expect from a small furry critter in a zombies map. Next, we have the Marine SP. This is actually one of the guns that you get access to first in the game as you're starting to level, so it's extremely tempting to start leveling it up and getting attachments for it, and you really should, because it's really solid. And zombies always has meta shotguns, and this is a shotgun that is very performant in zombies, so it makes sense to really give it a try. And when you pack-a-punch it, it basically will just delete whatever you point it at, and its name is Bakunawa, which is a serpent which looks like a dragon in Philippine mythology, which makes sense because Terminus is in the Philippines, and it's believed to be the cause of eclipses, earthquakes, rains, and wind, and it's just generally badass. This thing is a really, really cool bit of mythology, and it's a super fitting name for the Marine SP because it just does so much damage chunking those zombies when you get to tier 3 pack, for example, and you've got it fully kitted out. So this one, I highly recommend. Now, we covered the XM4, for example, all reliable. I think the only contender really to the XM4 in the all reliable category is none other than the AK-47 itself, and it performs exactly how you'd expect an AK to perform at base without being pack-a-punched, but when you pack it, it turns into Rasputin's Rebuke, and I don't know, I think that AKs are sort of notorious for having high stopping power, but being a little hard to control. And I think that's kind of still the case here, except that in zombies, I don't think you really care if a weapon's hard to control, so it's a pretty decent combination. But because of that, it does suffer a little bit in the ammo count department compared to something like the XM4, which has a little bit more in reserve at base. Again, that's without a lot of crazy attachments on your weapon. The next pistol on the list is crazy. So this one is called the GS-45, and unpacked, yeah, it's just another pistol, I would say. It's not immediately obvious what it's going to turn into when you're using it in its unpacked form, but you put it in the pack-a-punch machine, and this thing turns into the Sally. And that might sound weird because we're used to hearing Mustang and Sally, but it's just going to be a single pistol, this one. It's the Sally on its own, but it does exactly what Sally does best, and that's blow stuff up. So combined with PhD Flopper, this is incredibly satisfying to use. The zombie ragdolls fly everywhere, and it's just a plain fun weapon. So this is actually one of my favorites on this list. Next, we have the C9 SMG. This is basically a standard MP5, so it's a little bit more mobile than some of the ARs in the game, for instance, but with that comes smaller magazine size and overall just a little bit less firepower. And I think the devs hate this weapon, I'm gonna be honest, because when you pack-a-punch it, it goes from the C9 into the senile. Yeah, like old person that has lost their faculties. Senile. It's not exactly a flattering pack-a-punch name, and yeah, I mean, it's not exactly a flattering weapon either. It's not that great papped. It does have a lot of ammo in reserve, but so do most guns, so nothing special here. Next is the SVD, and I like this one. It kind of feels like it should be a marksman rifle, kind of, except it's obviously a sniper rifle, so it packs a heavier punch than a marksman rifle would do. And Pack-a-Punch, the SVD name transforms into Shadow Veil Demon, and it doesn't gain a lot of ammo, which is really worth being aware of. This thing doesn't have a crazy amount in the back, but it makes up for it for what it has in the front. This thing is strong. So I'm a fan of this one. Next is the SWAT 556. It's a burst weapon, and I'm really not a fan of burst weapons in zombies. I think that they're very rarely the right choice. And when pack-a-punched, it turns into the War on Drudge, as in War on Drugs, I guess because it's called the SWAT, I guess. And to be honest, I just think it's bad. I think this is just objectively a bad gun. I think that you're going to miss shots with it. I don't think it should be a burst in the first place, but then I don't think it makes sense to single fire. I just think you should skip this one personally. Next up is the Grekova. This this is fun, man. Like, this is just one of those guns where I'm just like, this is stupid and it's not effective, but it's kind of fun. It's a full auto pistol. I mean, need I say more? And when you pack a punch it, it turns into the kraka. And I don't know, is it called that because that's the sound it makes when you're like shooting the zombies or something? I don't freaking know. But yeah, I mean, it sucks. Like, it's really not good, but it's just fun. I don't know. Having a gun that's just like absolutely rattling off at the hip. You just blasting the zombies with it. They're not dying, but you're blasting it. Like, something about that feels good sometimes, you know? Next up is the compact SMG. I'm gonna be honest. I used this once and I thought, this is terrible. And so I've never gone back to it. But unpacked, this is what it looks like. But when we pack a punch it, that actually kind of changes because it goes from this really awkward burst weapon to full auto. And so the firepower of the weapon's kind of unleashed a bit. So I wouldn't use this so much unpacked, but as soon as you pack it, it's a different beast. So I give it pretty strong marks there. Next is the jet gun. This is obviously a wonder weapon. So even without being pack-a-punched, this thing is pretty damn cool. It's a little different to the Black Ops 2 version of the weapons. So it's not going to explode in the same way that it used to, but it's still going to suck zombies in, and it has a new alt fire now, which is pretty cool. Now, when pack-a-punch, this thing turns into the Scramjet Model 3200, and I think this is a really strong wonder weapon. I wasn't expecting to love the jet gun, because jet guns always had a bit of a kind of Marmite-y vibe in the community. Some people love it, some people think it's awful, but I think this is just really good. The fact that you can continuously suck zombies in the way that you can is incredibly powerful. Like, ammunition in this game is such a scarce resource sometimes, and the jet gun getting around that is huge. And so based on that, I really give it very strong marks. Next up is the HE-1 rocket launcher, and unfortunately, it's not very good. But it is the closest thing that we've had to the Panzerschreck since, well, the Panzerschreck. So that's a bonus, I suppose, but yeah, not amazing. Next, we have the GPM G7. I think this thing's fine. I mean, shotguns overall, like I said, tend to be meta in zombies, so absolutely nothing wrong with it. When you pack a punch it, it turns into Munmu's Protection, and it's really good. It's basically an AA-12, so you're able to output a lot of damage very fast, but my experiences with these sorts of weapons tends to always follow the same pattern, which is that I think it's going to be amazing for just outputting crazy waves of damage, but that means that the individual per shot damage is lower, and as you start getting into the higher rounds, you're not going to be able to just stand there and spam your entire, whatever it's called, magazine or rounds, or I don't know how guns work. But you can't just empty the clip, basically, because you don't have time. And so just tippy-tapping zombies here and there, little tippy-taps, isn't as effective as just deleting them like you can with the Marine SP. And so I personally think that this is less good than the Marine, but I think it does somewhat come down to personal preference. Next is the Amez 85, and I'm gonna tell you straight up, I love this weapon. It's basically a Galil, and a Galil has always been an amazing pick in zombies and just in Call of Duty in general, all the way back to, what, Black Ops 1 and maybe even before, and it still remains true to this day. Unpack-a-punched, it's a joy to use this thing. It is just a really, really great weapon, and when you pack-a-punch it, it turns into the Hot Mess, which is an unusual name for the Amez 85, but I guess what they were going for was that unpacked it's a mess, and then packed it's hot mess. Like, that's kind of it. But to be honest, it's not a mess. It's beautiful. Next, we have the PU-21. This one's a pretty decent LMG, in my view. And when you pack a punch it, it goes from pretty decent to, yeah, good. I don't think it's insane, but I really enjoy using it. And it feels almost like what I wish the AK was, I guess. It's just a little heavier, obviously. Next is the LW3A1 Frostline. As a sniper, I kind of like this thing, but it is held back in a zombies context by the fact that its rechambering speed is a little on the slow side, but then when pack-a-punch, it becomes the Black Ice, or at least I think that's how you're going to pronounce it, and that would make sense because it's called the Frostline Unpacked, Black Ice Packed, and thankfully, the rechambering speed is massively improved, so it becomes a lot more viable, but I would also question, what are you doing using a sniper in zombies? Next up, we've got the KSV. This thing, I don't know what to think of. Let me know what gun this is in the comments down below. Is it some kind of bullfrog type deal? I'm not sure. And my confusion about it persists when it's pack-a-punched because it turns into the vicious sword clarinets. And so the KSV has turned into this because if you take KSV and reverse it to VSK, that's your vicious sword clarinets. And the sword clarinets is traditionally attributed to legendary Russian heroes of mythical times. And so Russian weapon, Russian heroes, it kind of makes sense. Next, we have one of the best weapons in the game right now, to be honest. This thing is extremely popular across all of Black Ops 6, and just unpack-a-punched, it's very strong. It does a lot of damage, and it's really solid overall. And when pack-a-punched, the nice thing about this is that it's got a good amount of ammo in a clip. It does a good amount of damage. I mean, I'm on round 13 here, but I've used it higher as well, and it continues to perform. And it's nice and mobile as well, which adds a really nice touch to the feel of the gun. Next is the DM10. It's a marksman rifle, and it's kind of trash, not gonna lie. And then it turns into the DM them instead of the DM10, and not a lot else changes in my view. I think that it's still just fairly subpar personally. It's instead of the one, and it's just fun. So yeah, this gets thumbs up from me. Next, we've got the Tanto 22. This is actually available on the wall in Terminus, so it's one of those guns that you can have basically any game if you desire it. And I'm not a huge fan of it. I've played with it quite a lot because it's on the wall, and while I guess it's kind of okay as an SMG, it just doesn't really do enough damage for me to really fall in love with it. And the same applies once it's pack-a-punched. It becomes the Kuba Kiri, but I'm gonna be honest, I couldn't care less. I think it's just mid. Next is the Goblin Mark II, and I've got to say, I'm not a huge fan of single-fire rifles, and so even though once you pack-a-punch it, yeah, those single fires do pack-a-punch, like they do slap, it just doesn't feel amazing to me. Like, I feel like I'm constantly spamming the trigger so much, and I'm not getting an actual crazy amount of damage in return. I'm just getting the same amount that I would be getting from like an XM4 or something. So in that regard, I'm like, yeah, I mean, personally, this isn't something that I would gravitate to, but if you like semi-auto stuff, then sure. Next on our list is the baseball bat, and at low rounds, unpack-a-punched, it's not even a one hit, so it's really not that great. But once you pack-a-punch it, it becomes a lot more satisfying, so I'd say this gains points for the fun side of things, more so than it does for the actual utility. But I mean, it's a baseball bat. You just gotta whack, 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 whack. Next, we have the ASG-89, and I think this one's fairly weak. I don't think it's crazy good personally. And when you pack it, it turns into the Jewel of the Drake, and I've got to be honest, it's fun because it's one of those weapons where you just don't have to reload. Like, it's just gonna allow you to fire forever, and that's enjoyable. But is that effective? Well, in this case, I don't think it's crazy good, but still, it gains style points for just being unique in that way, so I think it's okay. Next, we've got the Model L, and this is, I guess, kind of similar to the AK in that it doesn't have like a crazy amount of ammo in reserve at base, but it packs a reasonable punch. And then when you pack-a-punch it, it turns into this glitchy thing. Look at the magazine going everywhere. This is real weird. And it's called the Lead Lizzie. And yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of mid personally. I mean, you can see it being used on a mangler here and basically nothing happening. And granted, it's just pack one here, but doesn't blow me away. So Lead Lizzie gets low marks. Next is the Sarkov. And first of all, I've got to say, what a unique looking weapon. Kind of reminds me of the SVT from World at War. And pack-a-punched, it becomes the Sarcophagus, which I think is a cool name. It doesn't have a crazy amount of ammunition, but you'd kind of expect that from a marksman rifle. But in an ideal world, in my book, that'd mean that it'd be one tapping zombies in the head, especially at purple rarity like it is here, on those low round 20s. Like, you'd think that would be possible with something like this if it was a real killer, but it's just not. So this one doesn't really get great marks for me. Next, we have the Sigma rocket launcher, and this is definitely the best gun in the game to use on a parasite round because it's so precise, right? It's like a surgeon's tool. No, it's not. I'm kidding. It's an absolute riot. You can just blow everything up, and honestly, it might not be the smartest decision to use unpacked, but it's still fun. And then when you pack it, it sort of turns into feeling like you've got your own shoulder-mounted rocket launcher. Like, I imagine imagine if I was Iron Man, I'd have this thing kind of pop out of my traps anytime I wanted to blow something up in front of me. Like, it's just that kind of feel, and it's sort of quick scopes, and you can fire 3 rockets instead of the 1, and it's just fun. So yeah, this gets thumbs up from me. Next, we have the trusty ray gun. The ray gun is decent in Black Ops 6. It's not the best we've ever seen, but nor is it the worst. It's obviously fine at base rarity. You'd better have PhD Flopper because it's got a lot of splash damage and you've got to be careful of that. But it starts to come into its own once you Pack-a-Punch it. It manages to really still feel like a wonder weapon, which is good because sometimes in the past, the ray gun's kind of been the unloved stepchild that's sort of nerfed to oblivion and doesn't really do that much. So next we have the Beam Smasher. This is the Terminus wonder weapon, and this thing is fun to use, man. Both unpacked and Pack-a-Punched. It's got the same sorts of abilities in both cases. When packed, its name becomes the Supersonic Crusher, and basically you've got a big beam with this one, and then you've got a kind of slow ray that you can do with your alt fire. And I think the main attraction for Pack-a-Punching this thing is just the amount of ammo that you gain, because I don't feel like it has a crazy amount of ammo when it's unpack-a-punched, but it's a lot more to work with when it is packed. And it's strong as well, so it succeeds in both categories there.